Would Ralph Simmons please come up on stage? Ralph Simmons, ladies and gentlemen, was born in the north end of Halifax in 1910, 4 years before both Josie Lava and Gussie McClellan. He moved to Bridgewater before the Halifax explosion, which counted in the 2,000 North End Haligonians and Dartmouthians that died both of his wife's parents. Simmons has lived in Bridgewater all of his life and is as proud to say that as they are to claim him for the great honors he's brought to his hometown in a variety of endeavors ranging from sport to business. Ralph Simmons played everything. There was nothing he couldn't do in track and field. He won the United Church Tuxas Boys Maritime 6-event contest, which entitled him to represent Eastern Canada in the Canadian Championship. He came home with a bronze medal for finishing third in that prestigious national. He was the champion shot putter and sprinter in high school when Bridgewater High won the Acadia relays in each of the first 3 years of their existence, 1926, 1927, 1928. He also played hockey for Bridgewater High when they finished second in the province, and then led their Bridgewater High baseball team to a provincial championship. Later he starred in the senior leagues. He was a contemporary of both Josie Lava and Gussie McClellan, and his experiences mirror those times much as hers did. He and his teammates once had to push the hockey team bus from Spring Hill to Middleton in a snowstorm. One story I'm sure you'll enjoy had Don Vino and Ralph Simmons driving to Truro in 1932. Vino to run in the 5 mile, Simmons in the 220 and 440. About 5 miles from Truro, they saw a guy walking along carrying a pair of sneakers. They gave him a lift, and they asked if he was competing. Yes, he said, I'm going to run a lap or two in the 5 mile. And they said, what do you mean a lap or two? Well, said he, I want to see the meet. I don't have any money, so I figure if I enter the 5 mile and I run a lap or two, I can lay down, fake an injury, watch the rest of the races for free. Well, one of those races he got to watch was the 440 to determine the Maritime champion. Ralph Simmons had one more person cheering his win that day in Truro. Despite all the stories we read about the greenhouse effect, they seemed somehow to have many, many more very hot days back then. On one such blistering hot day, Simmons and Vern Evel, the Acadia speedster, left permanent spike marks in the hard Acadia track. In fact, in that same meet, Gene Irwin from Woodside blistered his feet so badly he had to go to a doctor. Of course, they didn't have $200 space-age shoes back then either. Times were different in other ways as well. One write-up entitled, "Country Boy Gets Lost in the Big City," gave evidence of a time to which all of us in sport would love to return. In order to understand this story, you have to be reminded that in the 30s, the old Wanderers grounds ended its 440-yard races by having the competitors leave the oval track and finish by going up the straightaway chute they used for the sprint races. Now, I'm sure you've guessed what happened. The country boy here was leading Frank Marshall into the stretch, but then out of force of habit, he kept going around the track. Marshall, of course, went on by himself to win the race. The wonderful part of the story is that Frankie Marshall and his coach, Hall of Famer Jack Thomas, insisted that the medal be given to Simmons. It's nice to imagine that this same outcome would occur if this were to happen in an important meet today, but there are a few of us that wouldn't bet on it. In 1930, Ralph Simmons trained in Hamilton with other Canadian Olympic hopefuls, including the great Johnny Miles. Miles was given a job with International Harvester, with whom he stayed for the whole of his working life. Unfortunately, when Simmons could find no work, he was forced to give up his dream and hitchhike home. In addition to his sprinting and field events, Simmons and Mac Miller used to compete annually in the Halifax Modified Marathon. They trained at home by changing clothes in an old derelict blacksmith shop, running 8 to 10 miles in the mud out to dry spring and back, and then washing up in a bucket after they broke through the ice skim. Anyone who's ever gone to a fishing camp in foul weather knows the smell wafting out of the sodden clothes that they threw up over the stove each evening, only to don again the following day when workout time came round again. One summer, Ralph Simmons received several requests to enter a Dartmouth meet at Baisley Field. He tried to explain he'd already committed to running in the Bridgewater 10-mile race on that same date. Rather than disappoint either group, He left Bridgewater at 5:30 a.m. to allow for the 3-hour trip to up the old road. He arrived in Dartmouth at 9, competed in the long jump, the high jump, the 100, the 220, the 440, the mile relay. He had lunch, jumped in the car, arrived home 11 and a half hours after he'd left that morning. 8 of them jumped in the car then at 5:20. They were driven 10 miles downriver to La Have. The race started for Bridgewater about 6:15. About a half mile from the finish, Simmons' shoe decided that it had worked hard enough for that day. The sole started to flap, forcing him to kick both shoes off and finish in stocking feet. How did he finish, you might ask? Well, he said he finished 5th or 6th. He can't exactly remember, but he does remember clearly that one of the prizes everybody got for finishing the 10-mile trek was a new pair of sneakers. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't yet talked about the sport where Ralph Simmons made his real mark. Simmons was a dominant curling figure in the 40s and 50s. During that period, he skipped a rink to the Maritime Junior title, 48-49, again in 1950. He was runner-up in the provincial playdowns 3 times. He won the Johnson Cup twice. He curled on 3 British Console Championship rinks, thereby representing the province in the McDonald Brier in 1950, then skipped his Bridgewater rink to repeat victories in 53 and again in 57. As he got older, he continued his amazing feats, skipping his Bridgewater rink on 2 other occasions to provincial senior championships. The first time his rink represented the province in the Brier in 1950, it was held in Vancouver, a 6-day, 5-night train ride away. 3 weeks were required for the train trip and the week of curling. The Nova Scotia group rode to Montreal, stayed overnight, then took a special train, picked up each provincial team as they went. As each new party boarded, a Ghent-equated party was organized. By the time they got to Vancouver, Simmons was so partied out he took a hot bath, went to bed for 10 hours. Although he's being entered as an athlete, Ralph Simmons could have certainly been qualified as a builder as well. Major positions he held include Charter Director of the Nova Scotia Sport Hall of Fame, President of the Bridgewater Curling Club, 1954 and 55, twice President of the Nova Scotia Curling Association, 11 years as Provincial Chairman of Senior Curling. He's a life member of both the Bridgewater Curling Club and the Nova Scotia Curling Association. In 1980, he was elected to the Governor General's Curling Club, an honor granted to elected members thought to have curled well, thought to have exhibited good sportsmanship and gentlemanly conduct, and those who always competed in the true spirit of the games. Ralph Simmons and his late wife of 57 years, Catherine Louise, raised 2 sons, Bill and Barry. He still plays more than 100 games of golf a year. Hall of Famer Miriam Penny says he could still sting the ball occasionally, but he never got really as good as he could have in either golf or curling if he'd only allowed the local ladies to coach him. This presentation is probably best concluded by quoting another South Shore superstar and Hall of Famer, Fred Fox. He said it better than I could. Ralph Simmons, said Fox, is one of the most versatile athletes and sportsmen ever turned out by any community along the South Shore, and in fact the province of Nova Scotia. It's my pleasure to present to you our 3rd inductee to the Nova Scotia Sport Heritage Centre Hall of Fame, a most deserved recipient, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ralph Simmons.
At this time, I would call upon the chairman of the selection committee for the South Shore, Mr. Jim Brown, to come forward to make the presentation. Ralph, I want you to know that upon coming into the hotel tonight, I ran into a gentleman who was sitting there waiting for me, and he said, look, I'm not able to stay for the dinner, but I want you to convey a message to Mr. Ralph Simmons. And the gentleman was Mr. Don Ball, the very distinguished Nova Scotian, and a member of this Hall of Fame, an honored member. And he said Don Ball represented his game with more class and distinction than anybody I've ever seen in my life. That's a tribute to you.
Thank you very much.
From Mr.
Very nice. I appreciate Don's thoughts.
You're in great shape. Are you still curling?
Yes? No, I don't curl anymore.
I know that you're playing 100 games of golf a year.
87 up until yesterday. Short, yes. I've still got some time, though.
Ralph, you went to the Brier in 1950, 1953, 1957, correct? 3 shots at the brass ring. Did well. But 30, 40 years ago, curling in Nova Scotia had not reached the level of national standards that it has reached since.
Oh, no. Everything was different in those days. The ice was different. The deliveries were different. And we were always amazed at the long slide, which we never had in our day. We stayed in the hack, and we couldn't go out by the tee line. But the Western teams changed that. They had the long slide right out to the hog line, which made quite a difference.
Did not Jerry Glintz, a Westerner who came to be an adopted Nova Scotian, introduce the slide here? Or well, partially?
Partially, yes. But Jerry didn't slide that far. I know I played him in the finals in Bridgewater in 1957. And he went out farther than I did, but we didn't go past the tee line.
You still take an active interest in the game and watch a lot of it, I'm sure.
Watch it.
What are the major changes over the last 30 years?
Oh, I think the ice is the big change, the equipment, and the attitude of the fellows who play the game. And it's made it a much more competitive game, and you have to be good at it or you don't get anywhere.
Women's curling has made tremendous advances. We saw Penny LaRocque up here earlier tonight, and Colleen Jones.
And some of those women who play in the Canadian team would give any men's team a good, hard fight.
That opens up another vast area of discussion. But
I guess the girls will be glad to hear that, won't they?
He's a charmer, folks. Ralph, the emphasis tonight has been on curling, and rightly so, because that's where you had your finest hours. But I was talking to Fred Fox, your fellow countryman from the South Shore tonight, who says, don't overlook the fact that Ralph Simmons excelled in many other sports. What was your next favorite?
I think track and field was my second. I like that better than most of them. And
did you compete against Fred?
Oh, yes. In fact, we ran on against each other and with each other in different relay teams.
Frank Nix had to be in there somewhere, too.
Yes, I remember Frankie. He was faster than I was, though, but for a shorter distance.
Ralph, it's great to see you looking so wonderful, and just get that golf game increased a little bit, because I think you probably need a little exercise.
Well, it's nice to be here, and all I'd like to say right now is that somebody said, well, what do you attribute your fairly good condition and long life? And I said, well, it's mostly to the fact that I had pretty good genes. And then I never smoked or never drank or never ran around with women until I was 5 years old.
Ralph Simmons, ladies and gentlemen.